I wanted to be a composer since I was 10, and I was also a gamer. So in my mind, they were on an inevitable collision course. My initial ambition was more singularly aimed at film, even though I was playing more games than anything else. But I moved to LA about 13, 14 years ago, just open-endedly, like, I'm ready for anything. And some projects that I worked on as a student in the game world managed to kind of come to life, and it got things rolling. And so it all started basically in an environment not unlike this. And I've been really lucky that for more than 10 years, the offers have kept coming. I mean, basically that's my whole job, is affecting how a game's final sort of emotional intake will be for a player. Sometimes you have a really huge impact on the game, where the game will actually be so influenced by the music that it ends up wrapping around the music instead of the other way around. There's a very funny example of that in Journey, where there's kind of this big cutscene in the game where the player has arrived at this sort of turning point, and then there's a long sequence where we see a kind of circular pictogram of everything that you've been through up to that point, ending with a sort of glimpse of this harsh environment you're about to go off into. And I wrote the piece of music before they ever designed the scene, and I just kind of had this very grand scene in my head, because they described it as something I thought would be quite dramatic. So I wrote this really emotional piece of music, and I sent it to that game company, and they had like the most primitive kind of mock-up of what they were going to do, and they just threw it away, and they said, we don't want you to change the music to fit, because the music is blowing so past beyond what we made, and not in terms of quality, but just like the scope of what it's trying to say is so much bigger than the scene. But we actually like that scope better, so give us some time and we'll fix the scene. And so I ended up not really touching that piece of music. They kind of completely rethought how to handle that sequence. That's not that common that something like that happens, but little micro adjustments can happen like that all the time, because we're basically just saying, here's this abstract emotional experience we want the player to have. Now maybe the gameplay gets us to here, so the music has to bridge that gap, or maybe the gameplay gets us to here and music is doing a lot of the heavy lifting. And that's a classic example of that I find is, especially in earlier generations of games, if they want there to be any kind of romantic thread or sort of emotionally vulnerable thread. Well, for the longest time, there wasn't a single games writer that had the slightest clue how to write dialogue or anything like that. And certainly game mechanics weren't really reinforcing that kind of thing. So you had a lot of really shallow attempts at something emotional and heartfelt and vulnerable and all of that. And so it was like the music is working overtime, which in some cases actually makes it worse. It makes you aware of how short the dialogue is falling. So it's on the composer, I think, to be sensitive to that disparity. But it's a classic example where it's like the game director or whoever would say, we know this isn't evoking the emotions that we want it to, so please help us. But then there's other times where I'll play a game and I'll think, this is so spot on that any music takes away from it. So what if there's no music at all? And I've made that advocation many times. Right? We would be pushing it into the area of melodrama if I added even one note. And we shouldn't do that, because it's real, it's authentic. Last of Us is a great example, where there's huge swaths of that game that have, not that I worked on it, but that game has, it's pretty immaculately scored, because there's lots of it that really doesn't have music, or the music is so subtle, because Troy Baker and Ashley Johnson, they didn't need help. They're brilliant, masterful performers, and Neil Druckmann wrote a hell of a script. And so it's like, any music is just likely going to make it feel cheesy. Or if anything, it'll make it feel like you're being emotionally manipulated in some soap opera way. And they made the very smart decision to say, let's back off. So, and that's one of the things that's really exciting about working in games now, is we're maturing as a dramaturgical art form, such that people are starting to realize those kinds of distinctions. You know, that maybe the music doesn't have to be, first off, maybe the games don't have to all be frickin' collect the coins, save the princess, collect extra lives. We can actually explore more with this medium. But, not that those aren't fun, but you know what I mean? Like, it's an infinitely variable way to experience something. Why do we keep limiting it to the same ridiculous tropes? That was that game company's whole MO with Flow, Flower, and Journeys. We want to make games for people that don't know that they love games. And so musically, I think we have to follow suit. I think we have to basically say, let's try to get more classy. Let's try to get more elegant and succinct and know when to do things and when not to do things and all of that as the art form is overall maturing.